My guest today is the CEO of World Vision in New Zealand, Clarke. Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Fantastic to be here, Andrew. Thanks for the invitation.
Looking at the topic of poverty, I mean, it's a big one, isn't it? What would you say is a definition? How would you describe poverty? And perhaps more importantly, what causes it?
When I first came to World Vision, I think my mind was poverty was about the absence of food, the absence of housing, the absence of things. Since I've been working with World Vision, what I've become increasingly aware of is poverty at its heart is absence of hope. Absence of hope for a future, absence of hope that there's an aspiration beyond simply getting through today.
In terms of causal factors, is this a naturally occurring thing, such as like natural disasters? It's one of those things that just happens, or is it more of a man-made thing?
I think it's man-made. Nelson Mandela, many years ago, actually when he was in prison, made an amazing statement. He said that apartheid is wrong, poverty is wrong, apartheid was man-made, poverty is man-made. And it's kind of a hard concept to understand, particularly when you hear someone like Jesus saying in Scripture, the poor will always be with you. Is it just a natural consequence of living in this world? Yeah. But when you actually look at the causes of poverty, what you see is a very complex mix of opportunities that aren't given to the poor, unfair trading practices, corruption, obviously droughts and natural disasters like that impact on the poor. But although the causes of poverty are quite complex and thus the solutions are often complex, at the heart of poverty is injustice, and that's man-made.
You talked about poverty being a man-made thing. Does that mean we also have the responsibility to do something about it?
Look, most definitely. I think for any Christian, poverty is not extracurricular. I grew up as a Christian and very much from an evangelical background and understood my faith very much being about my relationship with God and my salvation. It was as I grew as a Christian I started to realise that there was actually a public aspect to my faith. And if I have a concern for the church here in New Zealand, it is that I think so many churches have privatised faith rather than understanding actually the heart of the gospel is a relationship with Christ, but also a relationship with our world.
You also talked about the scripture, the poor will always be with us, or the words of Jesus. Do you believe that?
Well, I think we need to understand what Jesus was saying. And I don't think it was necessarily simply saying that, look, just accept the fact there will always be the poor. I think he was saying that as Christians, we will always be surrounded by the poor. And as by Christians, we will always identify with the poor in the sense of that's where you will find Christians, with the poor and with the marginalised. So I don't think he was saying that it's automatically just follows that there will always be poor. Now, of course, that's a huge challenge for Christians, but it's not one that I think we should shy away from.
Is it then something which is solvable? Can we tackle the sort of global extreme poverty that we see on our television screens, or is it just a cyclical problem which is going to keep repeating itself?
Look, absolutely. Poverty is complex, but I think there are nonetheless some quite simple solutions to address poverty. So let me give you a $5 example of how we can tackle poverty. So just something as simple as a mosquito net for a pregnant mother or a mother with a young baby will mean that child and mother don't get malaria. Now, malaria kills millions of people across the planet. Just a treated mosquito net is sufficient to actually save the life of that child and her mother. Replicate that 1 million times, and 1 million people are living today who wouldn't have lived otherwise. And the other interesting thing is that we look at poverty around us, and it's always messages of bad news. But here's some good news, and it's the untold story. If you and I were doing this interview perhaps 10 years ago, when we were both a lot younger, we would have been saying 40,000 children will die today under the age of 5 as a consequence of illnesses that would otherwise be treated. In other words, if they happen to live in New Zealand, they would get treated for those illnesses, 40,000. Now, the number is still really high. It's 22,000, but it's been halved in 10 years. Yep. And it's our firm belief that we can actually eradicate extreme planet from the planet. And not only that we can, but actually it's at the heart of the gospel that we must.
Who should be responsible for that? I mean, there are UN initiatives, there's government initiatives, there's organisations such as World Vision that are involved in that. Who should be responsible for tackling global poverty, do you think?
I think it's everybody. In truth, I think poverty often starts with ourselves and actually an assessment of poverty in our own lives. And poverty takes many faces, particularly if we're talking about the absence of hope being at the core of poverty. Just look around at many of the older people in our society and the loneliness that they feel and the lack of connection they have to family and to wider community, and that's poverty. Yep. Now that's right on our doorstep and we can do something about that. Just to talk about New Zealand though, and a story again of some of the surprises that have come to me since joining World Vision 2.5 years ago. When I went to Africa for my first time, I went to Malawi, And I expected to see poverty in the absolute sense. I expected to see malnourished children. I expected to see disease. I expected to see poor water. I saw all of that. What I didn't expect to see was this profound sense of hope and aspiration and connection. So what I saw among these young people was a connection to their God, a connection to their family, a connection to their land, and a connection to their culture. And one of the most delightful things of any visit is towards the end of the day. And just imagine a village, not a Cotswold village, but thatched houses nonetheless, but made out of mud. And you'll often have a sort of a park area in the middle, usually dusty dry. And as everyone comes back from the fields or from school, or wherever they are, they start playing. And all these children are playing games, multiple games, often football. And the football is made out usually of plastic bags that they've tied together and wrapped together. But what you hear is this incredible sound of laughter and of children laughing. And it's just the most delightful sound. And there's no distractions. There's no computers going, there's no iPods going, there's no noise other than the joy of laughing. Now I watch that and I think, is that poverty? No, that's hope and that's joy. And I come back to New Zealand. And I remember this vividly after my first trip. Arrived in Auckland, driving home past a leafy park. It was completely empty. It would have been perfect for football. And even better than that, they even had the goalposts up if anyone wanted to play football. And there was one old man walking a very elderly dog. Where were the young kids? They weren't connected. They're not connected in New Zealand to their land, to their culture, to their history. And as we know, many are not connected to their God. So I asked myself, who are the poor? And who are the rich? And you look in an absolute sense. Most New Zealanders don't have to worry about food on the table and fresh drinking water. But in a relative sense, in sense of hope and aspiration, then maybe the poor are a lot closer to home than we realise.
That spiritual aspect of it, I mean, that's very much at the core of World Vision. World Vision is coming from it. We've talked around, I suppose, the spiritual component. Coming back to where we opened, that aspect of hope, that aspect of saying, well, this is where we are now, but let's dream of a better future for us and for our children. That's a very spiritual principle as well, isn't it?
Look, it is. And to be honest, I don't know how you could possibly tackle poverty without tackling spirituality. Because at the end of the day, faith is about hope, and addressing poverty is about hope. So let me give you an example very close to home. I work a lot in South Auckland with communities there, and we often ask children in South Auckland the very same questions we ask children in Malawi, in parts of India, in Cambodia, wherever. We ask a very simple question: what do you hope for? What do you hope to do when you grow up? And what's fascinating, I asked that question in India, as I was doing earlier on this year, and you get answers: I want to be a doctor, I want to be a teacher. Both careers that obviously benefit the community. Interestingly enough, as an aside, in India, we also heard this time a lot of people want to be electricians. And the reason for that is because the Indian government has recently strung up a whole lot of lines of electricity cables across India. But most of these villages can see these wires on the horizon but are yet to connect. So you've got all these enterprising young boys and girls thinking, that can't be too hard. So we've suddenly got a whole generation of electricians growing. But the key point is you can talk to children about that, and often they'll be able to give you an answer. And if they can answer that question, it means they have hope beyond today. But quite often I'll ask that question here in New Zealand and find that children can't answer that question, because do you know what, for them, the big issue is, will they get through the day without being beaten up by their dad or beaten up by their uncle? Will there be enough food in the house when they get home at night? So for us, children having hope in a sense beyond today and hope in the future is spiritual, and it's at the core of poverty.
Chris Clarke, thank you very much for joining us.
It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you, Andrew.